The air inside the Miller estate didn't just smell like roasted turkey and expensive rosemary, it smelled like expectations. To Sophie, it was the scent of a trap. She sat at the mahogany dining table, which was polished to such a high gloss that she could see her own anxious reflection staring back at her from the wood. It was Thanksgiving, the high holy day of the Miller family calendar, and the tension was thick enough to carve with the heirloom silver. Every year, the drill was the same. Arthur Miller, the patriarch whose voice sounded like grinding gravel, would preside over the head of the table, while Eleanor, his wife, ensured that not a single sprig of parsley was out of alignment. Sophie felt like a splash of neon paint in a room designed in shades of beige and ivory. She was a corporate lawyer at a top-tier firm, a job she had taken largely to prove to Mark's family that she was worthy of their pedigree, but every minute spent in those glass-walled offices felt like a minute stolen from her soul. To her left, Claire, Mark's older sister, was currently dissecting the merits of various private preschools in the Upper East Side. Claire didn't talk, she performed. Every sentence was a subtle reminder of her own curated perfection. "Of course," Claire said, her eyes flitting toward Sophie with a practiced, thin-lipped smile, "it's so much harder for working mothers to get their children into the elite tiers. The boards look for involvement. I suppose that's the sacrifice you'll have to consider eventually, Sophie. If you ever decide to stop chasing billable hours." Sophie felt the familiar sting. It was a classic Claire move, a compliment wrapped in a barbed wire of judgment. Sophie looked at Mark, sitting across from her. He gave her a small, sympathetic wink, the kind of silent communication that had been their lifeline for 5 years. But even Mark's support couldn't fully buffer the weight of the Miller family's collective gaze. Under the table, Sophie's hands were trembling. Her phone, tucked into her lap, vibrated with a generic notification, but it felt like a beckoning light. She needed an escape, even if it was just a digital one. She needed to say the things she couldn't scream over the fine china. She opened the Notes app. It was a habit she'd developed during these dinners, a venting vault where she wrote down everything she was forbidden from saying aloud. It was her private sanctuary. The note: Thanksgiving, survival and the truth. "I am sitting here, and I feel like I'm disappearing," she began to type, her thumbs flying across the glass screen. "Arthur is talking about the hedge fund again, and I swear if I hear the word diversify one more time, I might actually fall face first into the sweet potatoes." Claire is being her usual brand of passive-aggressive perfectionist, judging my career choices while she sips a Chardonnay that probably costs more than my first car. She paused, taking a deep breath. The rhythm of the typing was cathartic. "Mark, I love you. I love you so much it hurts, but I can't do this anymore. Not the dinner, the life. I don't want to be a senior partner. I don't want to argue over contracts until my eyes bleed. I've been looking at that studio space on 4th Street. The one with the big windows and the kill in the back. I want to quit. I want to make things with my hands. I want to wake up and not feel like I'm heading to a deposition for my own life." She looked up. No one was paying attention. Arthur was mid-anecdote about a golf trip to Scotland. Eleanor was signaling the maid to refill the gravy boat. Sophie turned back to her phone, the words pouring out of her now like a dam had broken. "5 reasons you are the only thing keeping me sane in this room. The way you squeezed my hand under the table when your mom mentioned the family legacy. That secret look you give me when you're bored, the one that says you'd rather be eating pizza on the floor with me. You never once told me my dreams were small, even when I'm afraid they are. The way you look in that sweater, even if your mother picked it out. Because you're the only person in this entire house who actually sees me. I'm going to do it, Mark. I'm going to resign on Monday. Let's sell the grandmother's diamonds if we have to. Let's run. I need to be Sophie again, not Sophie Miller. I'm terrified, but as long as I have you, I think I can breathe. I want you to take me home and remind me why we started this. I want to be anywhere but here. She felt a rush of adrenaline. Writing it made it real. The plan to quit, the pottery studio, the admission of her own unhappiness, it was all there, pulsating in the palm of her hand. She wanted Mark to see it. She wanted him to know that tonight was the turning point. Sophie, dear. The voice was like a gunshot. Sophie jumped, her phone nearly slipping from her fingers. It was Aunt Martha, the family's resident gossip, leaning in from across the table with a predatory glint in her eyes. You've been awfully quiet, staring at your lap, Martha chirped. Is there something more interesting on that little screen than your family's company? Or are you just checking your emails? Work never stops for the ambitious, does it? The entire table went silent. Arthur's story died in his throat. Eleanor's wine glass paused mid-air. All eyes, 16 pairs of them, landed squarely on Sophie. I know, I was just. Sophie stuttered. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt the heat rising in her neck. Put the phone away, Sophie, Arthur said, his tone not a request, but a command. We are having a family meal. Etiquette still exists, even in the age of the internet. I'm sorry, I was just finishing a thought, Sophie mumbled. She needed to hide the phone. She needed to send the note to Mark and then lock it away forever. In a blind panic, her fingers fumbled with the screen. She tapped the share icon. She saw the Airdrop logo. Usually, Mark's contact photo, a picture of him laughing at the beach, was the only one that popped up because they were always close to each other. But tonight, everyone had their phones out. Everyone had their settings wide open for the family photo swap Eleanor had insisted on earlier. Sophie saw a list of names. Her thumb was sweating. She saw Mark's iPhone. She aimed for it. But as she moved to tap, Aunt Martha leaned further over the table, her elbow knocking into Sophie's water glass. Sophie flinched to catch the glass. Her thumb hit the screen. The blue circle began to spin. It didn't hit Mark's iPhone. It hit the icon right above it, everyone. For a fraction of a second, Sophie stared at the screen. The status bar was a cruel, relentless blue line. Preparing. Sending. Sent. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She looked around the table. At first, nothing happened. The world remained still. Arthur was reaching for the carving knife. Claire was adjusting her napkin. Then, it started. Ding. Arthur's phone, resting right next to his wine glass, lit up. Chirp chirp. Claire's phone, tucked into her clutch on the table, vibrated aggressively. Bloop. Aunt Martha's phone, hanging from a pearl lanyard around her neck, wailed. One by one, like a row of falling dominoes, every single person at the table reached for their device. A symphony of notifications filled the dining room, echoing off the high ceilings and the stoic portraits of Miller ancestors. Sophie sat frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She watched as Mark picked up his phone, his expression shifting from curiosity to pure, unadulterated horror. The confession wasn't private anymore. The raw, unfiltered reality of Sophie's heart had just been delivered to the entire Miller dynasty, right along with the turkey and gravy. The silence that followed the pings was the loudest thing Sophie had ever heard. The dining room of the Miller estate had always been a masterpiece of acoustic engineering. The high, vaulted ceilings were designed to carry the sound of polite laughter and the gentle clinking of crystal, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. But as the final chime of the 12th iPhone faded into the air, the silence that followed was not elegant. It was heavy, pressurized, and suffocating, the kind of silence that precedes a natural disaster. Sophie felt as though she had been ejected from her own body. She was hovering somewhere near the crown molding, watching the scene below with a detached, clinical horror. There she was, the girl in the forest green silk dress, sitting frozen with her thumb still hovering over a screen that had just betrayed her entire existence. Beside her, Arthur Miller was the first to move. His movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifying. He didn't pick up his phone with the curiosity of a man receiving a text, he picked it up with the gravity of a judge receiving a verdict. He adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses, the light from the chandelier glinting off the lenses. "What is this?" Arthur's voice was a low rumble, the sound of distant thunder. "Note 27 confidential? Sophie, did you just send a legal brief to the entire table?" Sophie's throat was a desert. She tried to speak, to claim it was a virus, a glitch, a Russian hack, anything. But her vocal cords had seemingly withered into dust. Across the table, Claire had already opened the file. Her eyes, normally sharp and calculating, were widening by the second. Her manicured thumb scrolled rapidly, her face transforming from confusion to a mask of cold, hard indignation. "Oh, it's not a legal brief, Father," Claire said, her voice dropping an octave into a dangerous silkiness. "It's a manifesto. Or perhaps a diary entry." Mark, who had been staring at his own screen in a state of catatonic shock, finally found his voice. "Sophie," he whispered, his eyes pleading with her to tell him this was a dream. "Sophie, did you mean to hit everyone?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. I Sophie started, but she was interrupted by a sharp gasp from the end of the table. Aunt Martha had reached the second paragraph. Screaming into the mashed potatoes. She read aloud, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and morbid fascination. "Arthur is talking about the hedge fund again, if I hear the word diversify one more time." Arthur's head snapped up. The judge persona vanished, replaced by the wounded pride of a man who believed his every word was gospel. He looked down at the screen, then back at Sophie. "You find my life's work tedious, Sophie?" "No. Arthur, Claire is being her usual brand of fake nice perfectionist," Claire interjected, reading directly from her phone with a cruel smirk. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Sophie's with predatory intensity. "I'm so glad we finally cleared that up, Sophie. I'd hate for my efforts at hospitality to be misunderstood as genuine." The room began to dissolve into a cacophony of overlapping voices as the rest of the family caught up. The symphony of pings had evolved into a chorus of condemnation. "Selling the grandmother's diamonds." Eleanor's voice was a frantic bird chirp. She wasn't angry yet, she was in a state of pure, aristocratic bewilderment. "The Miller heirlooms. To fund what is a kill, exactly? Is that for the pottery? Sophie, you want to leave the firm to make bowls." The word bowls was spat out as if it were a profanity. Sophie felt the heat in her cheeks reaching a breaking point. The porcelain prison she had imagined in Chapter 1 had finally shattered, but the shards were cutting everyone at the table. She looked at Mark, hoping for a rescue, but he was currently occupied with his younger brother, who was stifling a laugh. "Number 4, Leo," the younger brother, whispered loudly. "The way you look in that sweater, even if your mother picked it out." "Nice one, Mom. Even the boring lawyer thinks he's a mannequin." "Leo, shut up." Mark snapped, but the damage was done. The dinner had officially descended into chaos. The carefully curated Thanksgiving theater was gone, replaced by the raw, bleeding truth of Sophie's inner monologue. She watched as Eleanor began to fan herself with a linen napkin, her face turning a delicate shade of mauve. "I think I'm having a palpitation," Eleanor moaned. "Arthur, did she really say she wanted to run from us?" Arthur didn't answer his wife. He was staring at the 5 reasons list. His eyes softened for a split second, perhaps at the realization of how much his son and daughter-in-law loved each other, but then they hardened again as he reached the part about the resignation. "Monday," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the room, silencing the bickering. "You intend to resign on Monday?" Without a word to the partners. Without a transition plan. You would throw away a decade of prestige for a studio with big windows. He looked at Sophie not as a daughter-in-law, but as a failing investment. It's not just about the windows, Arthur, Sophie finally said. Her voice was small, but it was there. The sheer extremity of the situation had pushed her past the point of fear and into a strange, numb territory of honesty. It's about the fact that I can't breathe here. I haven't been able to breathe for years. Oh, please, Claire scoffed, tossing her phone onto the table with a theatrical clatter. We've all had a difficult year. But most of us have the decency to keep our unfiltered truths in our heads, or at least in a locked diary, rather than broadcasting them to a dozen people over the main course. I didn't mean to broadcast it. Sophie cried, her frustration finally boiling over. It was an accident. I was writing to Mark. I was trying to stay sane so I wouldn't ruin your perfect dinner. Well, mission failed, darling, Claire replied coldly. The dinner is ruined. The reputation is tarnished. And I believe the gravy is getting cold. The sheer absurdity of Claire's comment about the gravy broke something inside Sophie. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat, a sharp, jagged sound that startled the room. The gravy. Sophie repeated, her eyes wide. That's what you're worried about? Not the fact that I'm miserable? Not the fact that Mark and I are basically playing characters in a play you've directed for 30 years? You're worried about the gravy. Mark stood up then, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor. That's enough, he said, his voice firm in a way Sophie had rarely heard at this table. Mark, sit down, Eleanor commanded. No, Mom, Mark said. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on his father's stern face and Claire's smug expression. Sophie didn't mean for you to see that note. It was private. It was her heart. And the fact that her confession feels like a grenade to this family says a lot more about us than it does about her. He turned to Sophie, his eyes soft and determined. Is it true? About the studio on 4th Street? Sophie nodded slowly, a single tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. I went to see it 3 times last week. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd think I was crazy for giving up the salary. Mark reached across the table, ignoring the shocked gasps of his relatives, and took her hand. I don't care about the salary, Soph. I care about the girl who used to draw on the back of napkins because she couldn't stop creating things. I missed her. For a moment, it was just the two of them. The tension, the anger, and the judgment of the Millers faded into the background. But the background was not quiet for long. This is all very touching, Aunt Martha piped up, her eyes still glued to her phone screen. But I'm still on page 3, and Sophie, dear, what exactly did you mean by spicy in point number 6? The room went deathly silent again. Sophie's heart stopped. She had forgotten. The note was longer than she remembered. She hadn't just listed career goals and family frustrations. She had listed other things. Mark's face went from pale to a deep, vibrant crimson. Aunt Martha, he gasped, put the phone down. Right now. But it says here. Martha. Arthur barked. The patriarch stood up, his presence filling the room like a dark cloud. He looked at the wreckage of his Thanksgiving dinner. His wife was on the verge of a faint, his daughter was armed with enough blackmail material for a decade, and his son was holding hands with a revolutionary who wanted to trade corporate law for clay. We are going to eat, Arthur announced, his voice broke no argument. We are going to finish this meal in silence. And then, Sophie, Mark, we are going to have a very, very long conversation in my study. Sophie looked at the turkey, which now looked like a cold, beige monument to her failure. She looked at Claire, who was already typing a text no doubt to her group chat. She looked at Mark, who was still holding her hand. The symphony of pings had ended, but the real music was just beginning. The confession was out. The bridge was burned. And as Sophie took a bite of the now infamous mashed potatoes, she realized that for the first time in 5 years, they didn't taste like ash. They tasted like the truth. But as she glanced at Aunt Martha, who was still trying to scroll down to the spicy bits, Sophie knew the next hour was going to be the longest of her life. The mandate for silence issued by Arthur Miller was less of a request and more of a temporary ceasefire in a war that had only just begun. For exactly 4 minutes, the only sounds in the grand dining room were the rhythmic scraping of silver against porcelain and the heavy, synchronized breathing of 12 people who were all desperately trying not to look at their phones, which sat like unexploded landmines beside their wine glasses. Sophie stared at her plate. The turkey was now a cold, dry slab of poultry that felt like sawdust in her mouth. She could feel Claire's gaze burning into the side of her head, a physical heat that made her skin prickle. She knew Claire was waiting for the perfect opening, a crack in Arthur's armor of authority, to deliver the killing blow. It was Aunt Martha who broke the treaty. She was a woman who lived for social friction the way a fire needs oxygen. She cleared her throat, a sharp, bird-like sound that made everyone jump. "I simply cannot get over paragraph 4, Martha whispered, though in the tomb-like silence of the room, it sounded like a shout. "Sophie, dear, you mentioned my unsolicited advice regarding your biological clock as a reason to consider a lobotomy. I was under the impression we were having a lovely chat about your future last Christmas." The dam broke. The silence Arthur had commanded evaporated instantly, replaced by a flood of grievances that Sophie had meticulously documented in her digital burn book. "And what about the hedge fund boredom?" Arthur boomed, slamming his hand on the table. The crystal rattled, a delicate sound that punctuated his fury. "I spent 40 years building a legacy that provides for this family, for your husband, and by extension, for you. To call it a soul-crushing exercise in greed is not just rude, Sophie, it is a fundamental betrayal of the hand that feeds you." Sophie looked up. The numbness was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She had spent 5 years being the perfect addition to the Miller family. She had worn the right dresses, laughed at the right jokes, and billed 2,500 hours a year at a firm that treated her like a high-functioning machine. If the bridge was burning, she might as well enjoy the light. "It is a soul-crushing exercise in greed, Arthur," Sophie said, her voice steadier than she expected. "You talk about diversifying like it's a religious experience, but you haven't asked Mark how he's doing once tonight. You haven't asked about his latest project. You've talked about the market. You've talked about the legacy. You haven't talked about the people." The table gasped. Claire let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Oh, please. Spare us the eat, pray, love monologue, Sophie. You love the lifestyle. You love the Soho loft and the summer trips to the Hamptons. You can't judge the machine while you're enjoying the oil." "I don't love it, Claire," Sophie countered, turning to face her sister-in-law. "That's the point you missed in the note. I'm drowning. And as for you being fake nice, would you prefer I used a different term? Because calculated hostility masked by expensive skincare was my second choice." Claire's face went white. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped her wine glass so hard the stem looked like it might snap. "You ungrateful, little..." "Enough!" Eleanor cried, her voice trembling. "The diamonds, Sophie. Let's talk about the diamonds. My mother's diamonds. You said you wanted to sell them for Clay? For a kill?" This was the heart of the matter for Eleanor. The physical symbols of the Miller lineage were being threatened by a woman who wanted to make pottery. "The diamonds were a wedding gift, Eleanor," Sophie said softly. "They are mine. And I would rather they fund a life that makes me happy than sit in a dark safe deposit box while I slowly lose my mind in a corner office. They represent a future I actually want to live." The conversation was no longer a dinner, it was an interrogation. Every line of the airdropped note was being dissected like a lab specimen. Aunt Martha was still scrolling, her eyes wide as she reached the bottom of the document. "Oh my," Martha breathed. "Mark. I had no idea you and Sophie were considering a permanent relocation to a cabin in Vermont without a cell tower in sight. Arthur, did you know they were planning to desert the firm?" Arthur's eyes narrowed until they were mere slits. He looked at Mark. "Is this true? You would leave the firm? You're on the track for junior partner. The path is cleared for you." Mark, who had been surprisingly quiet during the initial skirmish, finally set his fork down. He looked at his father, then at his wife. The fear that usually resided in his eyes when he spoke to Arthur was gone, replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. "The path isn't cleared, Dad," Mark said. "It's a tunnel. And there's no light at the end of it. Sophie didn't mean for you to see that note, but every word she wrote about how I feel, she's right. I'm tired of performing. I'm tired of being the Miller success story while I'm miserable behind my desk." "You're being dramatic," Claire snapped. "Everyone hates their job. That's why they call it work. You suck it up and you cash the check." "Like Leo?" Mark asked, tilting his head toward his younger brother. Leo, who had been trying to remain invisible, suddenly found the spotlight fixed on him. He looked at Sophie, a strange spark of solidarity in his eyes. "Leo?" Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What does Leo have to do with this?" "In the note," Leo said, looking at his phone, "Sophie mentioned that I'm the only other person in the room who looks like they're planning a prison break. She's right. I've been failing my chemistry labs on purpose, Dad. I don't want to be a doctor. I want to do graphic design. I've already been accepted into a program in Chicago." The revelation was like a second grenade going off in the middle of the dining room. Eleanor buried her face in her hands. Arthur looked like he was having a physical struggle to remain in his chair. The perfect Miller family was disintegrating in real time, all because of an accidental thumb slip on an iPhone. "This is your fault," Claire hissed at Sophie. "You've poisoned the well. You've turned them against the family." "No," Sophie said, feeling a strange sense of peace amidst the wreckage. "I just turned the lights on, Claire. You're just mad because you can see the dust now." The argument devolved further. Claire began listing every perceived slight Sophie had ever committed. Aunt Martha started texting someone, likely a friend who wasn't invited, about the scandal of the decade. Arthur was demanding a full accounting of Mark and Sophie's finances. The unfiltered table was a mess of half-eaten food, spilled wine, and shattered illusions. The Millers were no longer a portrait of success, they were a collection of people who barely knew each other, shouting over the remnants of a turkey that no one wanted to eat. Through it all, Sophie and Mark held hands under the table. The spicy bits Aunt Martha was so obsessed with were still there, waiting to be read, but they felt insignificant compared to the tectonic shift occurring in the room. "I think," Arthur said, his voice cold and final, "that we should move to the study. Sophie, Mark, Leo. We are going to settle this. Now." As they stood up, the chair legs scraping against the floor sounded like the closing of a chapter. Sophie looked back at the table. The airdrop was still sent on her phone. She hadn't just sent a note, she had sent a message that the old life was over. As they walked toward the study, Mark leaned in and whispered in her ear. "For what it's worth, point number 6 was my favorite part." Sophie couldn't help it. She laughed. A real, genuine laugh that echoed through the hollow halls of the Miller estate, a sound that was entirely out of place, yet perfectly right. The unfiltered truth was out. And as the heavy oak doors of the study prepared to close behind them, Sophie realized that while the dinner was a disaster, she had never felt more alive. If the dining room was a theater for the Miller family's public performance, the study was the backstage office where the real, cold-blooded business of the dynasty was conducted. It smelled of aged bourbon, expensive leather, and the heavy, stagnant scent of old paper. Arthur Miller sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a piece of furniture so large it felt like a fortification. He didn't invite them to sit. He simply poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid catching the dim light of a green-shaded banker's lamp. Sophie stood beside Mark, their shoulders touching. Behind them, Leo leaned against a bookshelf, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but also fundamentally relieved that the secret was out. Eleanor sat in a tufted velvet armchair, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while Claire paced the perimeter of the room like a predatory cat. "I have spent 30 years, Arthur began, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper, insulating this family from scandal. "We are Millers. We provide stability. We provide leadership. And in 30 seconds of technological incompetence, Sophie, you have turned us into the laughingstock of the tri-state area." "It wasn't a scandal, Arthur," Sophie said, her voice sounding surprisingly loud in the muffled room. "It was a note. A private note. The only reason it's a scandal is because everyone in this room has been pretending for so long that the truth feels like a physical assault." "The truth?" Claire spun around, her eyes flashing. "The truth that you think I'm a fake nice perfectionist? The truth that you want to sell heirloom jewelry to play with mud in Vermont? That's not truth, Sophie. That's a midlife crisis delivered via airdrop. You've embarrassed me in front of my husband, my children, and my social circle. Do you have any idea how many texts I've received in the last 10 minutes? Aunt Martha has already forwarded your little manifesto to half of the country club." Sophie felt a twinge of guilt about the social fallout, but it was quickly eclipsed by a surge of defiance. "I'm sorry your group chat is blowing up, Claire. Truly. But maybe if you spent more time being regular nice instead of fake nice, you wouldn't be so worried about what people think of your family's internal dynamics. Enough of the bickering." Arthur slammed his glass onto the desk. "Mark. Speak. Tell me your wife is exaggerating. Tell me you aren't actually considering abandoning your post at the firm for a cabin in the woods." Mark took a step forward, his hand dropping from Sophie's to grip the edge of Arthur's desk. "She's not exaggerating, Dad. If anything, she was holding back. I've been drafting my own resignation for months. I just didn't have the guts to send it." Sophie's thumb did us both a favor. The silence that followed was different from the one at the dinner table. This was the silence of a structure collapsing. Eleanor made a small, choked sound of protest. "You're on the partner track, Mark," Arthur said, his voice pleading now, a rare crack in his armor. "I've spent a decade grooming you. You have the intellect, the pedigree, the—" "I have the misery, Dad," Mark interrupted. "I have the high blood pressure and the 3 hours of sleep a night. I have the hollow feeling in my chest every time I win a case that I know is morally bankrupt. I don't want the partner track. I want to wake up and not wish I was someone else." Arthur looked at his son as if he were speaking a foreign language. He turned his gaze to Sophie, his eyes hardening. "And you? You're the catalyst. You're the one who filled his head with these bohemian delusions. The pottery. The Vermont dream. You're the one willing to liquidate the Miller legacy for a hobby." "It's not a hobby, Arthur," Sophie said firmly. "It's a life. And as for the diamonds, you gave them to me. They were a gift. A symbol of welcome into this family. If the only way I can be a true Miller is to stay miserable and keep those stones locked in a vault, then maybe I was never meant to be a Miller at all." Eleanor finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "But the spicy parts, Sophie, how could you be so graphic? With the whole family reading? My sister, Martha, is never going to look at Mark the same way again." Sophie felt the heat rise in her neck again. Eleanor, that was never meant for anyone's eyes but Mark's. It was, an intimacy. The fact that the entire family is now aware of our appreciation for one another is unfortunate, but I'm not going to apologize for loving my husband. There's appreciation, and then there's point number 6, Claire muttered, rolling her eyes. Can we talk about the fact that I'm leaving too? Leo chimed in from the back of the room. I feel like my graphic design rebellion is being overshadowed by Sophie's bedroom revelations. I've already put a deposit down on an apartment in Chicago, Dad. I'm not going to medical school. Arthur looked like a man who had been hit by a succession of tidal waves. His son was quitting the law. His daughter-in-law was a revolutionary potter. His youngest son was a dropout artist. And his daughter was currently recording the entire thing on her phone, which Sophie noticed with a jolt of annoyance. Claire, put the phone away, Sophie snapped. I'm just documenting the fall of the empire, Claire retorted, though she did slide the device into her pocket. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked older than he had an hour ago. The judge was gone. He looked like a CEO watching his stock price hit zero. If you do this, Arthur said, his voice cold and transactional, if you walk away from the firm, Mark, I will not support you. Not the move, not the studio, not the Vermont dream. You will be on your own. No trust fund, no safety net. You'll be living on whatever Sophie can get for those diamonds and whatever you've managed to save. Good, Mark said, without a second of hesitation. I don't want the safety net. The safety net is what's been strangling me. Sophie felt a rush of pride so strong it made her dizzy. She looked at Arthur, the man she had spent years trying to impress, the man whose approval she had craved like oxygen. She realized, in that moment, that his power over her was entirely self-imposed. He was just a man in a dark room, clutching a glass of scotch and a set of outdated rules. We're leaving, Arthur, Sophie said. Not just the study. We're leaving the dinner, the firm, and the perfect life you've designed for us. We'll send you the address in Vermont once we've settled in. If you want to come visit as a father, not a CEO, the door will be open. But don't bring your stock reports. She turned to Mark. Are you ready? Mark nodded, a genuine smile breaking across his face, the first one Sophie had seen all day. I've been ready for 3 years, sophomore. As they turned to leave, Leo stepped forward. Hey, can I get a ride? I think I've officially worn out my welcome here, and I'd rather not wait for an Uber in the middle of a Miller meltdown. The three of them walked out of the study, leaving Arthur staring into his scotch and Eleanor weeping softly into her velvet chair. Claire followed them out into the hallway, her expression unreadable. Sophie, Claire called out as they reached the front door. Sophie paused, her hand on the heavy brass handle. What, Claire? One last fake nice comment for the road. Claire looked at her for a long beat. She looked down at her own phone, which was still buzzing with notifications. Then, she looked back at Sophie. Point number 3, Claire said softly. You never once told me my dreams were small. Honestly. I'm jealous. No one has ever told me my dreams were anything other than a secondary consideration to the Miller brand. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a peace treaty. But it was the most honest thing Claire had ever said. Maybe you should airdrop your own notes sometime, Claire, Sophie said, a small, sad smile on her lips. You'd be surprised how much better you can breathe once the walls are gone. Sophie opened the door. The cold November air rushed in, smelling of dead leaves and freedom. They walked out into the night, the lawyer, the potter, and the artist, leaving the symphony of pings behind them. The airdrop had been a mistake, a terrifying, life-altering, socially catastrophic mistake. But as Sophie got into the car and felt the weight of the grandmother's diamonds in her purse, she knew it was the best thing she'd ever done. The heavy brass doors of the Miller estate clicked shut behind them, a sound that felt less like a latch engaging and more like a prison gate swinging open. The November night was biting, the air sharp with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of an approaching frost, but to Sophie, it felt like the first breath of real oxygen she'd had in half a decade. They walked in a strangely rhythmic silence toward the black SUV parked in the circular driveway. Mark clicked the fob, and the lights flashed a welcoming, mundane amber glow. Leo climbed into the back seat with the frantic energy of a man who had just escaped a sinking ship, while Sophie and Mark settled into the front. As Mark turned the key, the engine purred to life, the dashboard glowing with a soft blue light. He didn't put the car into gear immediately. He just sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, staring at the grand, illuminated facade of his childhood home. "I think," Leo said from the darkness of the back seat, his voice cracking slightly, "that was officially the greatest Thanksgiving in the history of the Miller family. Possibly the history of North America." Sophie leaned her head back against the leather headrest and let out a long, shaky exhale. "I'm pretty sure Aunt Martha is currently drafting a formal complaint to the Pope. Or at least to the head of the country club's ethics committee." Mark finally shifted the car into reverse. The gravel crunched under the tires, a satisfying, gritty sound. As they pulled away, the Miller mansion receded in the rearview mirror, its golden windows looking like the eyes of a fading beast. "So," Mark said, his eyes fixed on the winding, tree-lined road that led away from the estate. "Vermont. You've actually looked at cabins." "3, Sophie admitted, her voice low. She felt a strange mix of shame and exhilaration. "I have a folder on my laptop. It's hidden behind a shortcut titled Tax Law Amendments 2024. I've been looking at them every night after you fall asleep. There's one in particular near a town called Middlebury. It has an old barn that's already wired for high-voltage equipment. It's perfect for a kill, Mark. It has north-facing windows for the light." "A kill," Mark repeated, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You really want to play with mud, don't you?" "It's not just mud," Sophie said, her hands moving as if she were already shaping a piece of clay. It's something that doesn't require a billable hour to justify its existence. It's a bowl. You put soup in it. It's simple. It's honest. It's the exact opposite of a merger and acquisition contract." "I like it," Leo piped up. "I'll design your branding. Sophie's Shards. Or maybe the Airdrop collection, pottery so good you'll want to tell the whole family." Sophie groaned, burying her face in her hands. "Please. Never say the word airdrop in my presence again. I am going to throw my phone into the Hudson River the moment we cross the bridge." "You can't do that yet," Mark said, his tone turning playful. "We still haven't addressed the spicy section." Point number 6, Sophie. Aunt Martha was very concerned. "I believe she mentioned something about moral turpitude." Sophie felt the heat returning to her cheeks. "Oh, shut up. I was in a mood. I was sitting next to your father, listening to him explain the inherent nobility of the capital gains tax, and all I could think about was the last time we stayed at that hotel in Quebec. It was a survival mechanism." Point number 6 was quite descriptive, Mark noted, his eyes darting toward her for a split second, sparkling with mischief. "I didn't realize you had such a vivid memory of the balcony incident." "Mark. Hey, I'm in the car," Leo shouted, covering his ears. "Retain some dignity, people. I'm already scarred for life by seeing Claire's horrified yet curious face while she was reading paragraph 8. As they hit the highway, the city lights began to shimmer in the distance. The car felt like a small, insulated bubble of reality flying through a dark, uncertain void. Sophie reached into her purse and felt the cold, hard edges of the jewelry box. She pulled it out and opened it. The Miller diamonds caught the light of the passing street lamps, throwing jagged sparks of white and blue across the interior of the car. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also heavy. They were the physical manifestation of the expectations she had just shattered. "Are you really going to sell them?" Mark asked, his voice losing its teasing edge. "Yes," Sophie said firmly. She looked at the necklace. "Eleanor gave these to me as a welcome gift, but they always felt more like a collar. If I sell them, they become the kill. They become the kill, the clay, and the first 6 months of mortgage payments in Vermont. They become our freedom." "She's going to hate you for it," Leo warned. "Mom views those diamonds as a sacred trust. To her, selling them for a hobby is like using the Mona Lisa as a napkin." "Then she can buy them back at the auction," Sophie said. "I'm done being a curator for the Miller Museum. I'd rather have a working kill than a neck full of stones that I'm too afraid to wear to a grocery store." Mark reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'll sell my watch collection, too. The Patek my father gave me for making associate. It's gone. It's just a piece of metal that reminds me of how many hours I've wasted." "We're really doing this," Sophie whispered, the reality finally sinking in. "We're actually quitting." Monday morning, Mark confirmed. "We'll go into the office, hand in our physical files, and be out by noon. We don't even have to wait for the partners to have their Monday morning meeting. We can just leave our badges on the desk." About halfway home, Mark pulled into a brightly lit gas station. The neon hum of the open sign felt incredibly grounded compared to the stifling atmosphere of the Miller dining room. "I need coffee," Mark said. "And something that isn't turkey." They all piled out of the car. Standing on the cracked asphalt under the buzzing fluorescent lights, Sophie looked at her husband and her brother-in-law. They were all still dressed in their Thanksgiving best, Mark in his tailored wool sweater, Sophie in her silk dress, Leo in his designer blazer. They looked like people who belonged in a high-end magazine, but they were currently hovering over a rotating rack of hot dogs and debating the merits of various brands of beef jerky. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. "I feel like I've just woken up from a 10-year coma," Leo said, holding up a bag of neon orange cheese puffs. "Is this what real life feels like? Buying snacks at midnight without worrying if it aligns with the family brand." "This is exactly what it feels like," Sophie said, grabbing a bottle of cheap water and a chocolate bar. As they walked back to the car, Sophie stopped and looked up at the sky. The clouds had cleared, and the stars were visible, tiny, cold pinpricks of light. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like a narrow, carpeted hallway leading to a corner office. It looked like the dark woods of Vermont. It looked like a mess of wet clay on a spinning wheel. It looked like a terrifying, beautiful blank page. The last 30 minutes of the drive were quieter. Leo had finally fallen asleep against the window, the bag of cheese puffs clutched in his lap like a prize. Sophie and Mark sat in the front, the silence between them now filled with a sense of shared purpose. "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" Sophie asked softly as they pulled into their neighborhood. Mark was quiet for a long time. "My father? Probably not. He doesn't understand happiness as a metric. He understands equity." "Claire? She might, eventually. Once she realizes that the scandal actually gave her something to talk about for the next 5 years. But Leo? We just saved him, Soph." "You saved him." "The airdrop saved him," Sophie corrected with a faint smile. They pulled into the driveway of their Soho loft, the beautiful, expensive apartment that they would soon be putting on the market. They walked upstairs, the elevator ride feeling like a transition between their old life and the one that began tomorrow. Inside, the loft was silent and cool. Sophie walked over to the large windows that looked out over the city. The skyline was a sea of lights, thousands of people still awake, still working, still billing hours, still trying to be worthy. She pulled her phone out of her purse. She looked at the note one last time. 5 reasons you are the only thing keeping me sane in this room. She scrolled down to the bottom. She saw the sent status. She saw the list of people who had received it. She thought about Arthur's fury, Eleanor's tears, and Claire's hidden jealousy. Then, she did something she had been wanting to do since chapter 2. She deleted the note. "Hey," Mark said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You okay?" "I'm more than okay," Sophie said, turning in his arms. "I'm unemployed. I'm a social pariah. I'm probably about to be sued by my father-in-law for emotional distress. And I've never been happier." Mark kissed her forehead. "Tomorrow, we resign. Tuesday, we find a realtor. Wednesday, we start packing the kill. And Thursday?" "Thursday," Mark said, "we go to Vermont. And we don't bring our phones." Sophie laughed, a light, easy sound that filled the empty loft. She looked at the man who had stood by her in the inner sanctum, the man who had chosen a cabin in the woods over a partner's desk. The accidental airdrop hadn't just ruined a dinner. It had cleared the table for a brand new life.